crowded airport gate, a restless line of passengers, and one nervous boy clutching his boarding pass tighter than anything he had ever held before. That was how it began. To most, this flight was nothing more than another trip across the sky, but for him it became a test of dignity, a confrontation with cruelty, and an unexpected revelation that no one around him could have predicted. What unfolded inside that cabin would transform quiet humiliation into a moment of justice, so dramatic that every witness would leave changed. Stay with this story, and if it moves you, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think about the twists and where you're watching from. Ezekiel Monroe was 16 years old, lanky and quiet, carrying himself with the uneasiness of someone who had learned too early that the world judged before it listened. He was a black teenager in a crowd where his presence drew more attention than it should have, and he felt that spotlight burn hotter in places like airports where rules, uniforms, and stares collided. That morning, he had woken early, pressing his shirt as best as he could, lacing his sneakers carefully, reminding himself to stay calm. His mother had told him more than once that sometimes the simple act of being black in the wrong space was enough to draw suspicion, and he carried those words with him as heavily as he carried his ticket. The boarding pass was damp at the corners from his sweaty palms, not because he was unprepared, but because he already knew what it meant to be watched differently. As he stood in line, he noticed the contrast. Families laughed, children tugged at parents' hands, and businessmen tapped on glowing screens. Their movements were natural, easy, filled with entitlement to space. Ezekiel's own stance was cautious, his shoulders pulled slightly inward, his eyes lowered. He wanted to take up as little space as possible. His dark skin made him stand out in the sea of lighter faces, and even before reaching the gate, he felt the weight of glances that slid over him and then lingered a fraction longer than they should have. The closer he got to the gate, the heavier the knot in his chest grew. Clarice Dutton stood at the boarding podium with a stiff posture and an expression carved out of habit and authority. She moved each line of passengers with mechanical efficiency, scanning passes, offering minimal nods, ushering them forward. But when Ezekiel reached her, the rhythm broke. Her eyes lifted, sharp and assessing, taking in his sneakers, his hoodie, the nervous way he held the ticket. The pause stretched longer than necessary, and with each second, Ezekiel felt himself shrinking beneath her stare. She took his boarding pass, but instead of sliding it across the scanner like she had for everyone else, she tilted her head, lips pressing together as though she had discovered a problem. Ezekiel knew his documents were fine. He had checked the gate number twice, studied the boarding time, and memorized his seat assignment. Yet Clarice flicked her wrist, gesturing him toward the line reserved for rechecks, the one where mistakes, frauds, and irregularities were sent. Her gesture was swift but sharp, decisive in a way that made it clear she didn't expect resistance. The message was unspoken but obvious. Not you, not here, not yet. Heat rushed into Ezekiel's face. He hesitated, his body stiff, his eyes searching hers for an explanation that never came. Behind him, a sigh of impatience rippled through the line. Someone shifted a suitcase with an audible clunk. Another passenger muttered under their breath. Ezekiel's throat tightened, his voice locked away by years of warnings from his mother. Do not argue, do not raise your voice, do not give them an excuse. Slowly, almost mechanically, he stepped to the side, boarding pass trembling in his fingers as he approached the secondary line. The officer at the recheck station took his pass, scanned it, frowned briefly in confusion, then waved him back toward the main line. There was nothing wrong, no error, no mismatch. Ezekiel felt the truth settle in his chest. Clarice had sent him there not because of a mistake, but because of him. Because his blackness was enough of a reason. The humiliation washed over him heavier than the officer's indifferent wave. Walking back toward the gate was worse than being sent away. He felt every eye on him, the quiet judgment that burned even in silence. Some passengers looked away quickly, as if ashamed for him. Others held their gaze, stern or irritated, as though his mere delay had been an inconvenience. Clarice did not meet his eyes when he returned. She scanned the pass briskly this time, handing it back with a flick of her wrist, dismissing him as if the ordeal had been nothing more than a technicality. but the smirk at the corner of her mouth betrayed what it truly was: an assertion of power, a reminder of where she believed he belonged. Ezekiel stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air brushing his skin, but the humiliation clung like heat. His ticket was bent now, edges curled from his tight grip, and each crease felt like proof of his nervousness, his difference, his unworthiness in her eyes. The hum of engines in the distance grew louder, a promise of the flight ahead, yet it did little to ease the sting. He told himself not to cry, not to let it show. Crying in public had never been safe. Endurance was the only armor he had, and he wore it silently, step after step, down the narrow tunnel toward the plane. The air inside the aircraft was cooler than the crowded jet bridge, yet Ezekiel felt no relief as he stepped across the threshold. He wanted to move quickly, to find his seat and disappear among the rows of passengers who had already begun settling in, but almost immediately another obstacle appeared. A male flight attendant with a tall frame and a square jaw, his name tag reading Gordon Keene, extended an arm across the narrow aisle and halted him. Ezekiel froze, his grip tightening on the strap of his backpack, trying to keep his head down and avoid confrontation. Gordon did not ask a question, but instead leaned toward him, scanning his small duffel and the faded black backpack slung over one shoulder. Without a word of greeting, Gordon yanked the zipper open and began rifling through the contents, as though he had uncovered contraband. The suddenness of it caught Ezekiel off guard, his pulse pounding in his ears as passengers behind him murmured impatiently. Gordon's hand dove into the bag and emerged with Ezekiel's sneakers, a pair of scuffed but carefully cleaned shoes he had hoped no one would notice. Holding them aloft with 2 fingers, Gordon twisted his wrist so that the nearest row of passengers could see. A few pairs of eyes turned, some widening in confusion, others narrowing with amusement. Ezekiel felt the heat flood his face, the humiliation of having something so personal displayed like evidence. Those sneakers were his pride, the ones his mother had saved to buy him years ago, worn thin by time but still cared for. Now they dangled in the air like a prop in a cruel performance. Gordon smirked faintly, then shoved the shoes back into the backpack carelessly, pushing the fabric so roughly that the seam strained. He zipped it halfway, leaving it gaping, and pressed the bag against Ezekiel's chest with a firm shove that made him stumble back a step. The narrow aisle had grown quieter, passengers turning their heads subtly to watch. Some shook their heads, annoyed at the delay, but others allowed their eyes to linger with judgment, their gazes heavy with an unspoken narrative. This black boy did not belong. Ezekiel wanted to melt into the floor, to become invisible, but Gordon was not finished. With a deliberate motion, he raised his arm again and pointed toward an aisle on the far left, the opposite direction of Ezekiel's assigned seat. The gesture was crisp, authoritative, and left no room for question. Ezekiel knew enough to obey even when he doubted, and so he nodded quickly, clutching his half-zipped backpack, and shuffled down the wrong aisle. The further he walked, the more disoriented he felt. Rows stretched endlessly, passengers already buckled in, storing their belongings overhead, talking quietly among themselves. As he passed, their eyes flicked toward him, some curious, some cold, many landing on his dark skin before drifting to his worn clothes. He caught fragments of expressions, lips pressed tight, brows arched, smiles that weren't kind but mocking. He kept his head down, moving as quickly as the narrow aisle allowed, but with every step the realization grew heavier. He was out of place again, deliberately misdirected to stumble through this gauntlet of judgment. Finally, he reached the end of the aisle and looked up, confused. The numbers above the seats didn't match his boarding pass. His assigned row was nowhere in sight. He glanced around helplessly, clutching his ticket, feeling the tide of humiliation rise again. A flight attendant at the far end gave him a puzzled look and gestured him back, pointing down the correct aisle. The walk of shame stretched twice as long on the return trip. Every passenger he had passed now watching him retrace his steps, whispering to each other as though his mistake confirmed their assumptions. By the time he returned to the front, Gordon had vanished further down the cabin, occupied with other tasks, leaving Ezekiel to pick up the pieces of his dignity alone. His legs trembled slightly from the combination of nerves and shame, but he pressed forward, determined to find a seat and sit down quietly. Yet the weight of what had happened lingered. He knew the sneakers had been displayed not because of a security concern, but because they were his, because they were a black boy's shoes, worn and unfashionable, easy to mock. He knew the wrong direction had not been an accident, but a calculated humiliation, a reminder that his place could be dictated, his path rerouted for the amusement of others. As he slid into the correct aisle, he could feel the atmosphere pressing down on him. Conversations quieted as he passed, eyes following him. His skin prickled with the awareness of being the only one singled out, the one turned into a spectacle before the plane had even left the ground. He clutched his backpack tighter, holding it against his chest like armor, the zipper still half open from Gordon's careless intrusion. Inside, his belongings jostled with each step, reminding him of the violation, the lack of respect. He longed for the safety of his assigned seat, yet even as he neared it, the sense of safety felt fragile, easily shattered by the next cruel gesture. He balanced on his toes, lifting his bag toward the overhead bin. His arms trembled with the effort, not because the bag was heavy, but because his body was still charged with nervous energy, his breath uneven as he stretched. At that exact moment, Clarice appeared as if she had been waiting. With a sharp, sudden movement, she reached up and slammed the bin door closed, the force of it rattling the latch and making Ezekiel flinch backward. The sound was loud, cracking like a whip above his head, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who turned their heads toward the disruption. Clarice did not pause to explain or assist. She simply pivoted on her polished heels and walked away briskly, her expression fixed and her hands adjusting her jacket, as though what she had done required no acknowledgement. Ezekiel's arms lowered slowly, his bag still in his grasp, his face heating with embarrassment. He knew she had seen him trying, had understood he was struggling, and instead of offering even the smallest gesture of help, she had chosen to humiliate him in silence. The other passengers glanced quickly, some whispering, others turning back to their seats, the quiet judgment written in their eyes. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, looking as though she wanted to say something but swallowed her words, choosing the safety of silence. Ezekiel lowered his backpack to the floor for a moment, pretending to adjust the straps, pretending not to notice the cruelty that had just played out so openly. His chest ached with the effort of staying composed, of holding in the sharp mix of shame and anger that threatened to spill. He tried again, this time lifting the bag toward the opposite bin, careful to avoid another confrontation. His arms ached slightly as he stretched higher, his fingertips brushing the edge, and finally he managed to wedge it inside. He closed the door softly himself, determined not to make noise, determined not to draw more attention. With his bag stowed, he turned back to his row, yearning to sink into the seat and escape the gaze of the cabin. But when his eyes fell on the seat, his relief evaporated. Gordon had been there before him. A blanket and pillow were spread across his seat, as if someone had already claimed it. The items were positioned deliberately, neatly folded, but unmistakably occupying the space, a silent but clear message. You are not welcome here. Ezekiel froze, holding his boarding pass in his hand, staring at the seat that was supposed to be his. Passengers nearby noticed his hesitation and looked between him and the chair, curiosity pricking at their expressions. To them, it might have looked like confusion, but to Ezekiel, it was the heavy weight of exclusion. His lips pressed together, his throat dry. He didn't dare move the blanket or pillow. He had been raised to know that any sudden action could be misinterpreted. Any act of defiance could be twisted against him. Instead, he stood there, clutching his ticket, waiting as though permission might be granted if he was patient enough. The aisle behind him grew crowded as more passengers filed in, their voices rising in mild irritation as they slowed to navigate around him. He became an obstacle in the flow of boarding, another inconvenience, another reason for sighs and mutters directed his way. He wanted desperately to sit, to disappear, but Gordon's work had been precise. The placement of those items was intentional, designed to delay him, to expose him once again as someone out of place. Ezekiel's feet shifted nervously, his knees weak from standing under so many stairs. The humiliation pressed heavier with each passing second. his skin hot, his breath uneven. He thought briefly of asking for help, of showing his ticket to the passengers nearby, but the memory of Clarice's smirk and Gordon's mockery clamped down on his courage. If he spoke, he feared it would only become worse. Finally, a passenger squeezed past him with an impatient huff, bumping his shoulder roughly. Ezekiel muttered an apology instinctively, though he had done nothing wrong. He glanced again at the blanket and pillow, then back down at the ticket in his trembling hand, trying to summon the will to claim what was rightfully his. But he stood frozen, paralyzed by the fear of escalation, paralyzed by the cruel certainty that if he dared to act, the narrative would not favor him. The moments stretched painfully, each one a reminder of how precarious his place on this flight truly was. He stood awkwardly, shoulders slumped, his tall frame folding inward as if he could shrink enough to vanish from sight. The murmurs of the boarding passengers rose around him, some voices tinged with irritation, others with curiosity, all of them converging into a chorus that made his heart pound harder. This was supposed to be a simple seat, just a chair among rows of identical chairs. But for Ezekiel, it had become a stage where his presence, his blackness, his very right to exist in that space was questioned and undermined. He knew deep down this was only the beginning. Clarice and Gordon had already marked him, already chosen him as the target of their cruelty, and the weight of that realization settled in his stomach like lead. But even as the humiliation grew, even as he stood there stripped of dignity, a small voice inside him whispered that he had to endure. He could not give them the reaction they wanted, could not let them see him break. So he held his ground silently, enduring the hostile stares, clutching his boarding pass like a lifeline, while the blanket and pillow mocked him from the seat that was supposed to be his. He slid his backpack under the chair in front of him and pulled his knees close, trying to make himself smaller, trying to avoid any further attention. But the flight attendants were not finished with him. Clarice approached with her clipboard and a handful of red pens that she used to double-check boarding passes. She walked briskly down the row, stopping briefly at random passengers, initialing tickets, and moving on without incident. When she reached Ezekiel, she lingered, her eyes narrowing on the bent boarding pass in his lap. Without asking, she snatched it from his fingers, pressed the tip of her red pen into the paper with deliberate force, and drew a large mark across the corner. The ink bled dark into the fibers, a scar that immediately distinguished his ticket from all the others. She looked around as though making sure nearby passengers could see her action, then turned and pinned the pass to the thin partition wall at the front of the section, placing it where anyone walking by could notice. The gesture was wordless but unmistakable, a symbolic branding that made Ezekiel's stomach twist with humiliation. He was no longer just a passenger. He had been marked as different, as a problem, singled out in a way that everyone could observe. He shrank into a seat, his hands clenching into fists in his lap, unable to retrieve the ticket now displayed like a warning sign. Moments later, the beverage service began, with Gordon pushing the cart slowly down the aisle, the rattling of cups and clinking of ice cubes filling the cabin. Ezekiel sat still, waiting, hoping to blend into the routine of water, soda, and coffee being distributed to each row. But when the cart reached him, Gordon leaned slightly, pouring water into a plastic cup, and then with a flick of his wrist, tipped it carelessly forward so that the liquid spilled not into the cup, but onto Ezekiel's shirt. The cold shock spread across his chest, soaking the thin fabric, seeping quickly through to his skin. Ezekiel gasped softly, but Gordon simply crouched, pulling a rag from his pocket, and began scrubbing at the carpet between the seats with meticulous attention, as though the floor mattered more than the boy he had drenched. He wiped at the plastic armrest, the edge of the tray table, even the side of his cart, but never once offered Ezekiel a napkin or an apology. The performance was intentional, exaggerated, and designed so that nearby passengers would notice the careful cleaning of everything except the person who had been harmed. Ezekiel sat frozen, the wet fabric clinging uncomfortably, his dark skin glistening under the cabin lights as the cold spread. He felt the sting of humiliation more sharply than the chill of the water. Around him he caught the shift of bodies, the averted gazes of passengers who recognized cruelty but chose silence. A man across the aisle looked up briefly, his jaw tightening, then returned to his magazine. A woman with a child shook her head subtly, but said nothing. The isolation pressed heavier with each second. Ezekiel left to soak in shame while Gordon moved on with the cart, offering smiles and polite words to everyone else as though nothing had happened. The contrast made the act even more brutal. Others were treated with routine kindness, while he was singled out for casual cruelty. Ezekiel pulled the edges of his hoodie around himself, trying to cover the spreading stain, but the fabric was already too damp. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his body tense, his breaths shallow. His mind raced back to every warning his mother had ever given him, the constant reminders to stay calm, stay composed, never give them a reason to escalate. He wanted to disappear into the seat cushion, to melt into the floor, to undo the moment. But the evidence was there for all to see, his damp shirt clinging to his frame, his ticket pinned up front in red ink like a scarlet letter. Each act had been calculated, building one upon the other, layering indignity upon indignity until it became nearly unbearable. And yet he sat in silence, his endurance the only weapon he had left. The hum of the engines outside grew louder as boarding neared completion, passengers buckling their belts and adjusting their belongings. Ezekiel remained still, his body cold, his spirit heavy. He thought of home, of his mother's encouragement, of the way she had always told him that no matter how much the world tried to diminish him, his worth was untouchable. But in that cabin, surrounded by strangers and singled out by those in uniform, that truth felt distant, muffled beneath the weight of visible cruelty. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, and steadied himself for what was to come. Clarice and Gordon moved down the aisles with trays and plastic-wrapped meals, their practiced motions efficient, their tones polite when addressing passengers on either side of him. He watched trays filled with steaming pasta, bread rolls, and small cartons of juice being handed out. He heard the soft thank yous, the faint crinkle of wrappers being opened, and for a moment he allowed himself the hope that perhaps the torment would pause, that he would simply be treated like anyone else. When the cart reached his row, Clarice glanced at him briefly, then set down a tray for the passenger on his left and another for the passenger on his right. She placed nothing on his tray table. Instead, she tossed a crumpled napkin into the center of the plastic, its wrinkles deep and greasy from prior handling, as though it had been discarded and recycled. The cart rolled on, and Clarice did not look back. Ezekiel stared at the napkin, disbelief mingling with shame. The aroma of warm food surrounded him, wafting from both sides, but his space was barren, marked by the insulting scrap of paper. His stomach clenched in hunger, but more than that, it clenched with humiliation, because the absence of the meal was not an oversight. It was deliberate, orchestrated with the same precision as the red ink on his ticket and the cold water on his shirt. He could feel the curious glances of passengers, some perhaps noticing, some perhaps pretending not to. The man on his left chewed slowly, his eyes fixed firmly on his fork as though pretending not to see, while the woman on his right shifted slightly, her tray balanced awkwardly, but neither said a word. Their silence screamed louder than any comment. As he tried to steady himself, his eyes flicked toward the overhead bin where he had stored his backpack. Panic struck when he saw the door slightly ajar, the space inside empty. His breath caught. He craned his neck upward, searching the nearby bins, but his bag was gone. The backpack that held his personal belongings, the one he had fought to protect, had vanished. His pulse surged, his fingers clutching the armrests as he scanned desperately. Then at the far end of the cabin, near the rear galley, he saw Gordon tucking something dark into a bin, his movements too casual, too precise. Ezekiel's chest tightened with realization. Gordon had moved it. The thought of standing and walking down the aisle filled him with dread. Every eye would follow him. Every face would interpret his movement through the lens of what had already been planted by the crew. A problem passenger, a disruption, someone marked in red. But his backpack was all he had, and he couldn't let it disappear. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose, his knees trembling as the plane jolted slightly along the taxiway. He stepped into the aisle, his head ducked, his eyes fixed on the floor. Passengers looked up as he moved, forks paused midair, conversations faltering. He could feel the sharp sting of their stares, their whispers, their judgment. He walked steadily, each step heavier than the last, the humiliation building as he moved past rows of passengers eating meals he had been denied. Their trays glistened with food, their mouths chewing, their hands steady, while his own hands hung empty, his stomach gnawed, his shirt cold and damp. He passed one row, then another, every face turned toward him as though his presence was an interruption to their comfort. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to sit down, to endure, but the thought of losing his bag pushed him forward. When he reached the rear, Gordon stood leaning casually against the galley wall, his arms crossed, a faint smirk curling at his lips. The overhead bin above him was shut, but Ezekiel knew what was inside. He lifted his hand slowly, hesitated, then opened it. His backpack was crammed awkwardly against the wall, wedged as though it had been stuffed carelessly. Relief surged briefly, but it was quickly drowned by the heavy weight of humiliation, because retrieving it meant admitting in front of everyone that his property had been tampered with, that he had been made to walk the length of the plane like a thief reclaiming stolen goods. He pulled the bag down, hugging it to his chest, his movements small and cautious. Gordon said nothing, but the glint in his eyes spoke volumes, satisfaction dripping from a silence. The return walk was worse. The whispers grew louder this time, some passengers leaning slightly to watch as he passed, others shaking their heads. A child pointed openly before being pulled back by his mother. Ezekiel's face burned. His vision blurred slightly as he tried to keep his focus forward, step by step. He reached his seat finally, slid in, and buckled the belt quickly, clutching the backpack on his lap like armor. His breathing was shallow, his chest tight, his skin clammy with shame. The cart had moved on, and meal trays had been distributed fully. He had missed his chance. His tray table remained empty except for the crumpled napkin, the symbol of his exclusion, the evidence of the cruelty he was forced to swallow. He tucked his backpack beneath his feet this time, unwilling to risk it again, though he knew possession alone would not protect him. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes briefly, the dull roar of the engines filling his ears. He thought of his mother's words about endurance and survival, but in that moment, survival felt like suffocation, each breath shallow, each humiliation deeper. His stomach churned with hunger, but the ache of hunger was nothing compared to the ache of knowing his black skin had marked him as a target from the moment he stepped into the terminal. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the hum of the engines grew steady as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Around him, passengers adjusted their seats, fiddled with their overhead lights and unwrapped blankets. The attendants began distributing headphones for the in-flight entertainment, moving efficiently down the aisles, smiling politely as they handed the small plastic-wrapped headsets to passengers row by row. Ezekiel watched closely, his eyes following the movements with a cautious hope that this time he would simply be treated like everyone else. He saw Clarice approach, handing sets to the passengers on either side of him, their hands receiving the items casually, without thought. But when she reached his seat, she moved past with a purposeful glide, her tray of headphones held firm, her gaze fixed straight ahead as if he did not exist. The empty space on his tray glared back at him, another deliberate denial, another reminder that he was being excluded not by accident, but by design. He sat frozen, the absence louder than any insult, his ears burning as though the silence around him was filled with unspoken agreement. The man on his left tore open his package, the plastic crackling in the quiet cabin, the sound slicing at Ezekiel's composure. The woman on his right adjusted her headset and leaned back comfortably, her screen flickering to life with a movie selection. Ezekiel stared at the black screen in front of him, his reflection faint and hollow, the absence of a headset making him stand out in the row like a defect, a flaw. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, and he gripped his thighs beneath the tray to steady himself. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the entertainment system glowing on every screen except his. Children giggled at cartoons, couples scrolled through comedies, business travelers tuned into news updates, and Ezekiel sat in silence, the only passenger left without the simple tool to distract him from the hours ahead. The absence was obvious, visible to anyone who glanced his way, and that visibility was the cruelty. Clarice had not needed to say a word. Her silence had shouted the message clearly enough. You don't deserve what everyone else has. As if to deepen the humiliation, Gordon appeared again, pushing a smaller cart filled with drinks and trash bags, collecting the remains of meals that others had consumed. His eyes flicked toward Ezekiel with a glint of recognition, as though savoring the discomfort he had caused earlier. When he reached Ezekiel's row, he leaned across abruptly, dropping a half-filled trash bag onto Ezekiel's tray with a thud that made the flimsy plastic sag across the surface. Bits of wrappers, crumpled napkins, and half-empty cartons pressed against the thin plastic, the faint smell of stale food and juice rising up immediately. Ezekiel recoiled slightly, his body tensing, his eyes darting around the cabin to see if anyone else had noticed. Of course they had. Passengers nearby stiffened, their gazes fixed on the trash sitting in front of him, some shaking their heads subtly, others looking away in discomfort. Gordon pretended to rearrange items on the cart, ignoring the grotesque display of garbage he had placed in front of a boy who had already been stripped of dignity. Ezekiel felt his stomach turn, the weight of the trash pressing down on his already empty tray table like a physical insult, a symbolic declaration that he was worth less than waste. He wanted to push it away, to shove it back at Gordon, to demand respect, but the memory of his mother's warnings rang in his head again and again. Don't give them a reason. Don't let them twist your anger into a weapon against you. His hands trembled as he kept them pressed to his knees, refusing to react, swallowing the humiliation like bitter medicine. Gordon eventually lifted the bag with exaggerated care, as though doing Ezekiel a favor, and moved on down the aisle, his smirk faint but unmistakable. The trash's brief presence left a stain deeper than its smell. Ezekiel stared at the faint moisture left behind on the plastic surface of his tray, a mark that felt like it would never disappear. He wiped it away quickly with the crumpled napkin Clarice had given him earlier, the irony not lost on him. Around him, the cabin returned to its normal rhythm, passengers turning back to their screens, their conversations resuming. But for Ezekiel, time had slowed, each cruel act layering onto the next, building a mountain of shame too heavy for his young shoulders. He leaned back into his seat, his chest rising and falling unevenly, his eyes closed tightly as though shutting them would shield him from the hostile reality. But the truth was written on his skin, in the way he was treated, in the silence of those who saw and chose not to speak. He carried the weight alone, his dignity stripped piece by piece, his identity made into a spectacle by those entrusted with ensuring comfort and safety. He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms, willing himself to hold on, to not break, to endure just a little longer. The flight had become a prison, the hours ahead stretching endlessly, and every humiliation was a reminder that survival for him meant silence, composure, and strength that should never have been demanded of a boy his age. He alone sat without, marked as less than, stripped down not by accident, but by the purposeful cruelty of those in uniform. He tried to keep his head low, his breathing steady, but the air felt heavier, pressing against him with each breath. The weight of humiliation was suffocating, and yet beneath it all, a small ember burned faintly, the spark of something deeper, something that he had carried quietly inside. That spark reminded him he was not powerless, that his presence was not an accident, that he had a place on this flight no matter what they tried to make him believe. The engine surged louder as the plane angled toward the sky, the vibration traveling through the floor beneath his shoes. Passengers adjusted themselves, some leaning back into naps, others settling in with movies and books. Ezekiel reached down slowly, his fingers brushing the zipper of his backpack. He hesitated, his eyes scanning the aisle for Clarice or Gordon, but they were both further down, focused on other tasks, their attention diverted. His chest tightened as he drew the bag up into his lap, unzipping it carefully. The motion was quiet, unremarkable to most, but for him it was monumental. He slipped his hand inside, fingers curling around the cool surface of something hidden deep within. When he pulled it out, the cabin light reflected off the polished metal, catching the attention of the passenger seated beside him. It was a card weighty and gleaming, engraved with the insignia of the airline and etched boldly with the name Monroe. The grooves of the engraving were sharp, deliberate, not something cheaply made or casually obtained. It was a symbol, one he had kept hidden for so long, a reminder of who he was and the blood that ran in his veins. The man sitting next to him, middle-aged with graying hair and a business suit, froze mid-motion as his eyes landed on the card. His expression shifted from disinterest to surprise, then to something closer to shock. He had seen such a card before, perhaps once, in the hands of someone connected to the highest ranks of airline staff. It was not a gift shop trinket or a collectible item. It was an exclusive emblem, issued only to the children of senior captains, a physical acknowledgement of lineage, of connection, of belonging. The man's lips parted slightly as though to speak, but no words emerged, and instead he stared, his eyes flicking between the boy and the card as the truth registered. Ezekiel held the card carefully, his thumb brushing the engraved letters, his body still tense, but his heart beating with a strange new rhythm. For so long, he had endured in silence, bearing each humiliation as if it were inevitable, but now he had revealed a piece of himself that carried undeniable weight. The very name that Clarice and Gordon had tried to drag into the dirt was etched into that polished surface, linked directly to the authority that kept this plane aloft. He was not just any passenger. He was connected to someone who commanded respect in this very airline, someone whose authority towered above those who sought to humiliate him. The businessman sitting beside him glanced toward the aisle, his brows furrowed, his expression caught between disbelief and recognition. He seemed to shrink slightly, as though the realization carried with it an uncomfortable weight. Ezekiel, for his part, did not move to show the card to anyone else. He did not hold it up or wave around. Instead, he let it rest on his lap, visible enough for those closest to see, its presence quiet but undeniable. The metal gleamed faintly under the overhead lights, and though it made no sound, it spoke volumes. A ripple of awareness began to spread. The businessman leaned back in his chair, stealing glances, while the woman across the aisle tilted her head curiously, her eyes narrowing on the object in Ezekiel's hands. Passengers were subtle, but whispers traveled quickly, and soon the faint stir of recognition spread like a current through the rows. It was not loud, not yet, but it was enough to shift the atmosphere, enough to carve a fracture into the silence that Clarice and Gordon had so carefully orchestrated. Ezekiel felt the shift, the eyes beginning to notice, the energy turning. He had not spoken a word, had not lifted his gaze, but the truth of who he was had begun to seep into the cracks. He tucked the card gently back into his bag, sliding it beneath layers of clothing, careful not to expose more than he intended. The act of showing it had not been loud, but it had been deliberate, a whisper of resistance against the tide of cruelty. He leaned back, his backpack still on his lap, his hands pressed against it protectively, his heart steadying as he breathed deeply. Clarice and Gordon had not yet noticed, too busy moving through the aisles, too assured of their control. But the tide was shifting quietly, and Ezekiel knew that soon the balance would change. For the first time since stepping into the terminal, he did not feel completely stripped of dignity. He felt a sliver of strength returning, not because the cruelty had stopped, but because he had reminded himself, and those who happened to see, that he was not just a target, not just a boy to be mocked. He was someone with a name that carried weight, a connection that mattered more than they could imagine. The businessman beside him still cast cautious glances his way, the weight of recognition heavy on his face, and though Ezekiel had tucked the card away, the truth of it lingered in the minds of those who had seen. But Ezekiel was not finished. The cruelty had cut deep, stripping him piece by piece, but he carried more than they could take from him. And now he felt a growing strength that urged him to push back, not with words or confrontation, but with undeniable evidence of who he truly was. Slowly, with a resolve that belied the trembling of his hands, he unzipped his backpack again. He reached past the notebooks and the spare shirt, fingers brushing against the cool surface of something carefully wrapped. When he pulled it free, the dim cabin lights reflected off polished silver, catching the attention of the woman across the aisle, who leaned slightly forward in curiosity. Ezekiel placed a small airplane model on his tray table with care, his fingertips lingering on the engraving carved into its side. The words shimmered in the faint light, "For Ezekiel Captain Elias Monroe." The weight of those words was heavier than the model itself. It was not a trinket from a store or a toy bought at an airport kiosk. It was a gift crafted specifically for the children of senior pilots who had given decades of service, an heirloom of sorts, bestowed in rare moments, when a career had spanned long enough and loyally enough to warrant special recognition. Each model bore a name, a personal mark connecting family to legacy, parent to child, sky to blood. Ezekiel's father had given it to him years ago, telling him to keep it close as a reminder that he carried not just his own identity, but the pride of a family bound to the skies. He had kept it hidden, tucked away, because he knew the world could be cruel, and he had wanted to protect it from mockery. But now, as it rested in plain sight, it gleamed like a beacon of truth that could not be denied. The businessman beside him leaned closer, eyes narrowing on the engraving, his mouth opening slightly in shock. The woman across the aisle whispered something to her companion, pointing discreetly at the model. A murmur spread slowly, the way small ripples spread outward on still water. Heads turned, passengers leaned subtly, and the silence in Ezekiel's row grew thicker as the recognition traveled. Some had seen such a model before, in the hands of children waiting proudly at terminals, their parents in uniform leading them confidently through airports. Others knew the stories of Captain Elias Monroe, a name spoken with respect by those within the airline industry, a man known for his precision, his discipline, and his years of loyal service. Now before them sat his son, the boy they had watched being humiliated, excluded, mocked, and treated as less than human by the very crew meant to serve him. As if the moment had been orchestrated by fate itself, a uniformed airline security officer made his way down the aisle. He was conducting a quiet check, ensuring order as the plane settled into cruising altitude. His steps slowed when his eyes caught the gleam of silver on Ezekiel's tray table. He stopped, bent slightly, and studied the model more closely. His brows furrowed, then lifted in recognition. He reached out, not touching, but pointing toward the engraving, his lips forming the name silently before he nodded. He had seen it before in ceremonies in the hands of families who had given their lives to the company. He turned his gaze toward Ezekiel, his expression shifting from routine professionalism to something closer to respect, even apology. The murmur in the cabin grew louder, whispers swelling into small waves of conversation. Passengers who had looked at Ezekiel with irritation earlier now looked at him differently, their expressions tinged with guilt, with realization, with discomfort. The weight of the truth was settling in around them, undeniable and sharp. Clarice and Gordon had not yet noticed, busy at the far end of the plane, but the tide was shifting beneath their feet, and soon the truth would wash over them whether they liked it or not. Ezekiel sat quietly, his hands resting near the model, his body still tense, but his eyes steadier now. He did not need to raise his voice or demand attention. The silver airplane did the speaking for him. It carried the weight of legacy, the authority of his father's name, and the unspoken truth that he was not some anonymous boy to be trampled on, but the child of someone who had earned the respect of this very airline. He could feel the atmosphere changing, could feel the unease of those who had witnessed his humiliation but said nothing, now confronted with the undeniable reality that they had been complicit in cruelty against someone who carried honor they could not ignore. The officer nodded once more, straightening to his full height, and gave Ezekiel a look of acknowledgement before continuing down the aisle. The act itself was small, but its meaning reverberated. It was recognition validation, proof that the truth could not be buried under red ink, spilled water, missing meals, or trash bags. The truth had surfaced, shining in silver, engraved permanently into metal and memory. Ezekiel leaned back slightly, the faint hum of the engine steady in his ears, the model gleaming on his tray as if to say his suffering had not been unseen, and the tide of power was finally beginning to shift. Passengers who had watched in silence began to whisper, and then to murmur, and soon the quiet disbelief grew into a swelling chorus of voices that rolled down the aisle like a wave. Heads turned toward Clarice and Gordon, eyes narrowing with accusation. lips forming words that cut through the stale cabin air. Unfair, cruel, unacceptable. The businessman seated beside Ezekiel leaned back, his arms crossed now, his expression firm with disapproval not directed at the boy, but at those who had mistreated him. The woman across the aisle who had once looked away leaned toward her companion, shaking her head, her voice rising just enough for those around her to hear that she had seen everything and could not believe what had been done. The murmurs collided, multiplied, and sharpened into something undeniable. Clarice approached slowly, her sharp heels clicking against the narrow aisle as she carried herself with the same arrogance that had colored every action she had taken since the gate. But this time, instead of smug glances, she was met with narrowed eyes and folded arms. Passengers stared at her, their expressions hardened, their whispers rising into audible condemnation. She faltered slightly in her step, her eyes scanning the faces that no longer looked at her with respect but with suspicion and contempt. Gordon followed a few rows behind, pushing the cart with a stiff motion, his jaw tight as he caught the angry stares. He shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence dimming beneath the weight of the collective judgment. Ezekiel sat quietly, his chest rising and falling in measured rhythm, the silver airplane model still gleaming faintly on his tray table, his backpack resting safely at his feet. He said nothing, needing to say nothing, because the truth was speaking louder than any words could. The whispers escalated into voices loud enough to reach the cockpit. A man in the row ahead of Ezekiel stood, his face stern, his voice steady as he announced what many had seen, pointing directly at Clarice and Gordon. Others chimed in quickly, recounting the spilled water, the missing meal, the denied headphones, the trash bag dumped on the boy's tray. Their words carried weight because they were many, not one, and because their tones carried outrage no authority could dismiss. The accusations traveled like fire, consuming the silence, and soon the entire section of the plane throbbed with indignation. Clarice attempted to defend herself with gestures and tight-lipped explanations, but her voice was drowned beneath the rising tide of passengers speaking over her, their anger sharp and undeniable. Gordon tried to retreat, wheeling the cart backward, but passengers stopped him with piercing stares and pointed remarks, refusing to let him slip away unseen. The commotion grew so intense that the cockpit door opened, and another uniformed crew member stepped out to assess the situation. Behind him, murmurs of radio communication carried faintly into the cabin, and Ezekiel felt a sudden swell of nervousness. For so long, the balance of power had been stacked against him, but now the momentum had shifted, and he wondered whether the airline would truly side with him. Yet as more voices rose in unison, there was no mistaking the reality. The crew had been exposed, their cruelty made undeniable by the testimony of dozens. The uniformed officer moved quickly to the back, relaying the disturbance to ground management as the flight prepared for an unscheduled halt at the nearest airport. Passengers leaned across aisles, sharing their observations, uniting in their anger. Some clapped softly when Ezekiel's name was mentioned, not in mockery, but in recognition of who his father was and what he represented. Others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that they had never seen anything so openly cruel on a flight. The energy in the cabin shifted further, no longer oppressive, but charged with the anticipation of justice. Ezekiel sat still, his hands resting on his lap, his shoulders squared now, though his body trembled faintly from the whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. He felt seen for the first time, not as a problem, not as a disruption, but as a victim whose truth had finally surfaced. The descent toward the airport felt longer than it truly was, the cabin filled with the low rumble of voices, passengers demanding accountability. When the wheels finally touched the runway and the plane rolled to a stop near a waiting service vehicle, the cabin erupted into louder conversations. The uniformed officer reappeared, followed by two members of ground management who boarded quickly, their expressions tense and serious. They moved directly to Clarice and Gordon, who stood frozen mid-aisle, their arrogance stripped away and replaced with pale-faced anxiety. Passengers around them pointed, voices rising again, recounting the litany of humiliations they had inflicted upon Ezekiel. The managers listened, nodded, and then turned cold eyes toward the attendants, their verdict swift and decisive. Clarice's lips parted in protest, but no one listened. Gordon clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the cart tightly as though it might anchor him against the tide. But it was useless. The order was given, and both were escorted out, their uniforms suddenly appearing flimsy, their power shattered. As they moved reluctantly down the aisle, passengers erupted into applause, thunderous and unrelenting, echoing in the cabin like a storm. Some clapped fiercely, others shouted words of support for Ezekiel, their faces alight with vindication. The sound enveloped him, filling his chest with warmth that pushed back against the cold of all the earlier humiliations. He lowered his gaze, his cheeks burning not from shame this time, but from the overwhelming flood of validation. He pressed his palms together briefly, grounding himself in the moment, the roar of applause wrapping around him like a shield. Ezekiel glanced at the silver model still on his tray, the engraved words glimmering in the light. He thought of his father, Captain Elias Monroe, a man whose years of service had built a legacy strong enough to shield him even when cruelty tried to strip him bare. He thought of his mother's voice, always reminding him to endure, and realized that endurance had led him here, to this moment when the truth had burst open and justice had finally taken root. As Clarice and Gordon disappeared from the cabin, the applause slowly died down, replaced by a steady silence filled not with hostility, but with respect. Ezekiel leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, his chest rising with a newfound strength. The cabin had grown calm after the eruption of applause and the removal of Clarice and Gordon, but the energy of what had happened still pulsed beneath the surface like a drumbeat. Passengers whispered in low voices, their eyes turning again and again to Ezekiel, some offering small nods of encouragement, others unable to hide the guilt that shadowed their expressions for having stayed silent too long. Ezekiel sat quietly, his hands folded on his lap, his chest rising and falling steadily, the silver airplane model still glimmering faintly on his tray table. The humiliation of earlier still clung to him in fragments, the sticky dampness of his shirt, the ache in his empty stomach, the sting of being marked and mocked. But for the first time since he entered the airport, he no longer felt invisible. He was not the problem passenger they had tried to paint him as. He was a boy who had endured cruelty with dignity, and now the truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. The cockpit door opened, and the sight that followed made the murmurs in the cabin dissolve into silence. Captain Elias Monroe, tall and steady in his crisp uniform, stepped into the aisle, his presence filling the space with the authority of a man who had commanded skies for decades. His eyes moved slowly across the cabin, taking in the tension that lingered, the stares of passengers who straightened instinctively under the weight of his gaze. Then his eyes settled on Ezekiel, and in that moment the boy's shoulders loosened just slightly, the weight of all the indignities lessened by the simple act of being seen by the one figure whose presence carried unshakable authority. The captain walked steadily to his son's row, his polished shoes clicking against the floor in rhythm with the hushed breaths of the onlookers. When he reached Ezekiel, he placed one hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that was both intimate and declarative, an acknowledgement of the pain endured and a public affirmation of who he was. The cabin stirred again, passengers leaning forward, whispering as they recognized not only the authority of the man, but the connection between father and son. Captain Monroe nodded to the passengers seated nearby, his voice calm, but carrying with the resonance of a man used to being obeyed. He thanked them for standing up when injustice unfolded and reminded them that the skies belong to everyone, regardless of race or background. His words were few but heavy, each syllable falling like an anchor in the silence. He did not need to recount the cruelty or expose the names of those removed. The truth was already etched into the memory of everyone on board. Instead, he focused on the dignity of endurance, on the necessity of refusing to tolerate prejudice in any form, and the responsibility each person carried to speak when silence had once been chosen. The passengers responded with nods and murmurs of agreement, some applauding quietly once more, others lowering their eyes in shame as they reflected on the moments they had hesitated to intervene earlier. Ezekiel sat still, his chest full, his father's hand anchoring him. his identity affirmed not by the cruelty of others, but by the legacy he carried within his very name. The flight resumed after the disruption, but the cabin was transformed. Where there had once been silence complicit in cruelty, now there was conversation filled with reflection and acknowledgement. The businessman beside Ezekiel, who had once only watched, leaned toward him and whispered words of respect, apologizing for not doing more sooner. The woman across the aisle smiled gently, her earlier hesitation replaced with the courage to speak, and told him to stay strong because the world needed more young men who could endure what he had endured with grace. Ezekiel nodded quietly, absorbing their words, understanding that while their apologies did not erase the pain, they mattered because they signaled recognition, the very recognition he had been denied again and again. Hours later, when the plane finally landed and the passengers filed out into the terminal, the story of what had happened did not fade. Many spoke of it openly, voices filled with outrage and determination to see change. The airline could not ignore the storm of testimony, and within days, Clarice and Gordon were suspended indefinitely, their names stripped of the authority they had once wielded so carelessly. The company issued a formal statement, acknowledging the harm done to Ezekiel and committing to a comprehensive retraining program for all flight staff, designed to dismantle the quiet prejudices that had been allowed to fester. The statement spread quickly, reaching beyond the cabin and into the broader public, sparking conversations about the treatment of Black passengers in spaces where silence had too often prevailed. For Ezekiel, the scars of the flight did not disappear overnight. The memory of sitting in damp clothes, of being forced to walk the aisle under stairs, of being treated as less than garbage, lingered in his body like echoes of a nightmare. But the memory of the moment when the tide turned, when the card and the silver model had revealed his truth, when his father's hand had rested firmly on his shoulder, was stronger. It reminded him that even when the world tried to strip him of dignity, the core of who he was could not be erased. It reminded him that silence did not always last forever, that voices could rise, that justice could arrive, even if belatedly. The end. If this story held your attention, let me know by hitting the like button and subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the way Ezekiel was treated and how justice finally turned in his favor? Was the ending satisfying to you, or would you have wanted something more to happen? Share your perspective in the comments, and while you're at it, tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Your voice adds to the conversation, and together we can make sure stories like this remind us why dignity, justice, and equality matter.